Most people who have even heard of the Gothic War picture it as a footnote, a messy, forgettable scuffle somewhere between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Middle Ages, fought by people whose names they can't pronounce, over a peninsula that had already stopped mattering. If they know anything at all, they know the headline version. A Byzantine emperor decided to take Italy back from the barbarians, sent a brilliant general to do it, and after a lot of marching around, the Romans won. Empire restored, Rome reunited, roll credits. Here's the problem. That story is not just simplified, it's almost the opposite of what actually happened. The Gothic War didn't restore the Roman world. It destroyed what was left of it. It took a functioning, wealthy, still recognizably classical Italy, a place with intact aqueducts, working senates, thriving cities, and a population in the millions, and it left behind a wasteland of ash, plague pits, and abandoned farmland that would take the better part of 1,000 years to recover, if it ever fully did. The emperor who launched this war believed he was reviving Rome. What he actually did was finish killing it. And the most unsettling part of this story is not the war itself. It's the fact that almost everyone involved believed they were doing something noble, and their combined nobility produced one of the most complete societal collapses in European history. So let's go back. Not to the war itself, but to the ambition that caused it, because you cannot understand why the Gothic War happened without understanding the mind of the man who started it. And that mind was gripped by an idea that had already been dead for 60 years. In 476, a Germanic officer named Odoacer had quietly deposed the last emperor to rule from Italy, a teenager with the almost comically grand name of Romulus Augustulus, and declared himself king. No armies clashed for the fate of civilization that year. No one wrote that the sky had fallen. Life in Italy, for the most part, went on. Roman law still applied. Roman senators still sat in the Senate. Latin was still the language of government. What had changed was simply who wore the crown, and increasingly, that crown belonged to men who called themselves kings rather than emperors, and who traced their bloodlines to the forests and steppes beyond the old imperial frontier. By the early 6th century, the kingdom that controlled Italy belonged to the Ostrogoths, ruled first by the remarkable Theodoric the Great, a king who had been raised partly as a hostage in Constantinople and who spent his reign doing something almost nobody expected from a barbarian conqueror. He preserved Rome. He restored its buildings. He kept the Senate functioning, protected the old aristocracy, patronized Roman scholars, and ran a government that, in practice, looked astonishingly like the empire it had replaced. Historians today still argue about how genuinely Roman Theodoric's Italy was, but the basic fact is not in dispute. Italy, under the Ostrogoths, was peaceful, prosperous, and by the standards of the age, remarkably well governed. It was not a smoking ruin waiting to be liberated. It was, if anything, one of the more stable corners of the post-Roman world. 1,400 kilometers to the east, in Constantinople, sat a man who looked at this arrangement and saw not stability, but sacrilege. His name was Justinian, and he had inherited an empire that still called itself Roman, still used Roman law, still crowned itself with the memory of Augustus and Constantine, even though it had not controlled the city of Rome in decades. Justinian did not see himself as the ruler of a shrunken, regional Greek-speaking state. He saw himself as the rightful heir to the entire Roman world, and he treated the loss of the West not as history, but as an ongoing injustice that it was his personal, sacred obligation to correct. This is the detail that most casual retellings of the Gothic War skip entirely, and it matters enormously. Justinian's wars of reconquest were not primarily about territory or wealth or strategic necessity. They were about restoring what he genuinely believed was a divinely sanctioned order that had been interrupted. His court propagandist, the historian Procopius, described Justinian's ambitions in language that reads less like statecraft and more like religious mission. This was a ruler who rebuilt the Hagia Sophia, codified Roman law into the great compilation that still shapes legal systems today, and genuinely believed that restoring imperial unity was part of restoring the correct order of the cosmos itself. In 533, he sent his most gifted general, a young and brilliant commander named Belisarius, to reconquer North Africa from the Vandal kingdom. The campaign was shockingly fast. The Vandal kingdom, which had stood for a century, collapsed in months. Justinian took this as confirmation. God, or fate, or history itself was on his side, and Italy was next. But Justinian needed a pretext, because even an emperor convinced of his own destiny still had to justify a war to his court, his treasury, and his allies. And in 534 and 535, that pretext arrived in the form of a palace murder. The Ostrogothic throne had passed to a woman named Amalasuntha, Theodoric's daughter, who had been ruling as regent and then as queen, and who had cultivated a close and cooperative relationship with Constantinople. She was, by the standards of the Gothic nobility, dangerously pro-Roman, educated in classical literature and deeply unpopular with a faction of Gothic warriors who saw her as soft and compromised. To secure her position, she made her cousin Theodahad co-ruler. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Theodahad had her arrested and, in the early months of 535, had her murdered. Justinian's agents had reportedly tried to intervene on her behalf. Whether that concern was genuine or performative barely matters, because the murder of Amalasuntha handed Justinian exactly what he needed. Here was a queen, sympathetic to Rome, killed by a Gothic usurper. Here was a moral pretext dressed up as an act of imperial justice. Justinian declared war, and in 535 he dispatched Belisarius, fresh from his triumph in Africa, first to seize Sicily and then to cross into Italy itself. What followed in the first phase of the war looked, for a while, like exactly the kind of swift, decisive campaign Justinian had promised himself. Belisarius took Sicily by the end of 535 with barely a fight. He crossed into southern Italy in 536, took Naples after a difficult siege, and by the end of that year, Rome itself opened its gates to him. The city that had once ruled the known world, that had sat under Gothic authority for 2 generations, was Roman again, at least in name. It must have felt, briefly, like vindication. The old order was being restored. The wound of 476 was being healed. Then the Goths, now under a new king named Vitiges, marched south with a massive army and put Rome under siege. And here the war reveals the first of its hard truths, the one that most simplified histories gloss over entirely. Belisarius held the city for over a year, from March 537 into 538, with a garrison that was absurdly small compared to the besieging force. It was a genuine feat of military brilliance, but sieges are not won by brilliance alone. They are won, or lost, by supply lines, by food, by the ability of a population to endure hunger without turning on its defenders. The siege of Rome in 537 and 538 introduced something into this war that would define everything that followed. Not glory, famine. By 540, Belisarius had fought his way north and captured the Gothic capital of Ravenna, effectively ending organized Gothic resistance. The Goths, in a moment of desperation, actually offered Belisarius the crown of Italy himself, hoping a Roman king might be more palatable than continued war. Belisarius pretended to accept, used the offer to walk into Ravenna without a fight, and then declared the city for Justinian instead. It was a masterstroke of deception, and to modernize, it can look like the natural endpoint of the story. 5 years of campaigning, and the Gothic kingdom was finished. If the war had ended there in 540, it might genuinely deserve the tidy narrative most people carry around in their heads. A hard-fought reconquest, expensive, but ultimately successful, restoring Roman rule to Italy after 60 years. But the war did not end there. And what happened next is the part that almost nobody tells you, because it is the part that turns this from a story of imperial triumph into a story of imperial ruin. In 541, the same year Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople under a cloud of suspicion over his loyalty. Something arrived in the Mediterranean world that had nothing to do with armies or emperors or ambition. Plague. What historians now call the Justinianic plague, likely an early strain of the same bacterium, that would later cause the Black Death, swept out of Egypt and tore through the Byzantine world with a ferocity that is difficult to overstate. Constantinople itself may have lost a third of its population in a matter of months. The disease didn't respect borders, armies, or ambitions. It moved along the same trade routes and military supply lines that Justinian's empire had spent years reopening, and in doing so, it turned his own instruments of reconquest into vectors of catastrophe. This is where the conventional story of the Gothic War falls apart completely, because most retellings treat the war as a purely military contest between Rome and the Goths, with occasional mention of a plague as background noise. But the plague did not sit in the background. It gutted the Byzantine treasury at precisely the moment Justinian needed to fund a war on 2 fronts, because Persia, sensing opportunity, had reopened hostilities in the east. It killed soldiers, tax collectors, farmers, and administrators in numbers that no army could replace. Some historians today argue, much as economic historians reassess the causes of later catastrophes, that the plague did more long-term damage to the stability of Justinian's empire and its Italian conquests than any single Gothic king ever managed. It was not a footnote to the war. In many ways, it was the war's silent third combatant, one that fought against both sides simultaneously in answer to neither. And into this weakened, plague-stricken, financially exhausted situation stepped the man who would turn a nearly finished war into a decade-long catastrophe. His name was Totila, and he may be the single most underrated figure in the entire history of late antiquity. With the Byzantine treasury drained by plague and war in the east, Justinian starved his own Italian campaign of resources. Reinforcements that should have crushed any remaining Gothic resistance simply never arrived in sufficient numbers. Into that vacuum, the Goths rallied around Totila, who turned out to be not just a capable military commander, but a genuinely gifted political operator. He offered freedom to enslaved people who joined his cause. He treated captured Roman civilians with a restraint that stood in stark contrast to the increasingly undisciplined, unpaid, looting Byzantine garrisons left behind after Belisarius' recall. Roman peasants and Italian townspeople, who might once have welcomed liberation from Gothic rule, increasingly found the Gothic king's forces more tolerable than their supposed Roman liberators. Totila retook city after city. He recaptured Naples. In 546, after another agonizing siege, he took Rome itself, a city that by then had been besieged, starved, and fought over so many times that its population had collapsed to a fraction of its former size. Belisarius was sent back to Italy, but this time Justinian gave him nowhere near the resources or the trust he had commanded in the first campaign. He arrived essentially as a general without an army, unable to reverse the tide, and was recalled again in 549, his reputation quietly tarnished by failures that were never really his to control. For a moment, it looked as though the entire reconquest, the project Justinian had staked his legacy on, might simply collapse. Totila controlled most of Italy. Rome had changed hands so many times that Procopius himself, writing as a contemporary witness, described a city and countryside reduced to something almost unrecognizable, its population starved, its farmland untended, its old aristocracy scattered or dead. It took the arrival of a new commander, an aging, unlikely figure named Narses, a court eunuch and administrator rather than a career soldier, to finally turn the tide. In 552, at the Battle of Tagenae, Narses met Totila's forces directly and inflicted a decisive defeat. Totila himself was killed in the retreat, or died shortly after from his wounds, depending on which ancient account you trust. His successor, a Gothic warrior named Teius, fought on for another year in a last, desperate resistance that ended at the Battle of Mons Lactarius in 553, effectively extinguishing the Ostrogothic kingdom as an independent power. By 554, Justinian issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a legal document reorganizing Italy under Byzantine administration. On paper, 19 years after it began, the war was won. Now here is where you need to stop and actually absorb what 19 years of continuous warfare, famine, and plague does to a society, because this is the part the tidy version of the story leaves out entirely. And it is the part that actually matters. Italy in 554 was not the Italy Justinian had set out to reclaim. The great cities that had defined Roman civilization for centuries, Rome, Milan, Naples, had been besieged, sacked, starved, and fought over repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single decade. Milan, when it fell during the war, was reportedly subjected to a massacre so severe that ancient sources describe the deliberate slaughter of its male population, tens of thousands of people, in a single act of retribution. Rome itself, the Eternal City, had been besieged by one side or another at least 5 separate times during the conflict, its population plummeting from what had once been hundreds of thousands to, by some estimates, barely tens of thousands of desperate survivors. Aqueducts that had supplied the city with water for centuries were deliberately cut by besieging armies as a weapon of war, and some of them were never fully repaired. The agricultural land that had fed the peninsula for 1,000 years lay untended for years at a time while farmers fled, died, or were conscripted. And when the fields go untended in a pre-industrial economy, the result is not inconvenience. It is famine, and famine on top of plague. On top of war is what demographers call a mortality cascade, one where each disaster amplifies the lethality of the others. And Justinian, having spent an almost incomprehensible fortune and 2 decades of continuous warfare to reclaim Italy, inherited a peninsula so hollowed out that his empire could barely afford to hold it, let alone rebuild it. This is the cruelest irony sitting at the center of the entire Gothic War, and it is the reason the tidy version of the story is not just incomplete, but actively misleading. Justinian went to war to restore Roman Italy. And what he actually did was so thoroughly destroy Roman Italy in the process of reclaiming it that there was barely anything left worth calling Roman by the time he'd finished. The war didn't preserve classical civilization in the West. It delivered the killing blow that centuries of barbarian settlement had never quite managed to land. The proof of this came almost immediately. Justinian died in 565, having spent his final years overseeing an Italian province that was exhausted, underpopulated, and defended by an army that Constantinople could no longer reliably pay or reinforce. Just 3 years later, in 568, a new Germanic people, the Lombards, crossed into Italy and found almost nothing standing in their way. This was not a coincidence. It was cause and effect. The Byzantine victory over the Goths had been so thoroughly Pyrrhic, so completely draining that the empire that had just spent 2 decades and unimaginable resources reconquering Italy could not muster the strength to hold it against the next invader. The Lombards carved out a kingdom that would control large parts of the peninsula for the next 2 centuries, splitting Italy into competing zones of control that arguably set the template for the political fragmentation that would define the region all the way into the 19th century. Justinian's war to reunify Rome ended up being one of the direct causes of Italy's political division for the next 1300 years. So when you step back and actually assemble all of these threads together, the picture that emerges bears almost no resemblance to the clean, triumphant narrative most people carry around. You had an emperor in Constantinople whose ambition was not primarily strategic, but ideological, a genuine, almost theological conviction that reuniting the Roman world was a sacred obligation rather than a rational calculation of costs and benefits. You had a pretext, the murder of a pro-Roman queen, that provided moral cover for a war whose real motivations ran much deeper. You had an initial, deceptively swift campaign that created the illusion the whole enterprise could be won quickly and cheaply. You had a global pandemic arriving at the worst conceivable moment that drained the resources needed to finish the job, and turned a 5-year war into a 19-year war of attrition. You had a Gothic resurgence under Totola that succeeded precisely because Byzantine misrule and unpaid, undisciplined garrisons made the supposed liberators less welcome than the people they had come to conquer. And you had, at the end of it all, a devastated, depopulated, impoverished Italy that the victors could not actually hold, setting up the very next invasion that would undo whatever the war had accomplished in the first place. Each of these factors alone might have produced a difficult but survivable war. Together, they produced one of the most genuinely destructive conflicts in the history of the ancient Mediterranean world, a war so ruinous that some historians now argue it did more to end classical antiquity in the West than the original barbarian invasions of the 5th century ever did. The men who deposed Rome's last emperor in 476 largely preserved Roman civilization because it suited them to rule over something functioning. The emperor who tried to restore that civilization in the 6th century ended up burning it to the ground in the process of saving it. And there is a human dimension to this that rarely makes it into the history books, buried as it is under the names of kings and generals and the dates of sieges. Somewhere in the Italian countryside during those 19 years were farming families who watched their fields go to weeds while armies marched past, families who fled to the hills with whatever grain they could carry, families who returned to burned villages to find nothing left to return to. Procopius, writing as a contemporary, described scenes of starvation during the sieges so severe that people were reduced to eating grass, and worse. He described a Roman aristocracy that had once filled the Senate House reduced within a single generation to poverty and exile, their ancestral estates confiscated, burned, or simply abandoned because there was no one left alive to farm them. Entire towns that had stood since before the birth of Christ effectively ceased to exist, their population scattered or dead, their names surviving only in the writings of chroniclers who were themselves recording the end of a world. This is why the true story of the Gothic War matters, and not merely as a curiosity for people interested in obscure late antique history. It is a warning about a very particular and very recurring kind of catastrophe, the kind caused not by malice, but by conviction. Justinian was not a villain in any conventional sense. He believed, with total sincerity, that he was restoring justice and order to a world that had fallen into disorder. His conviction was so complete that he was willing to spend 2 decades, bankrupt his treasury, and burn an entire province to the ground in pursuit of an ideal that, in the end, I could not survive contact with reality. This is the pattern that shows up again and again across history in economic collapses and in wars alike. The people who cause the greatest catastrophes are very rarely cartoonish villains twirling a mustache. They are usually people utterly convinced of the righteousness of their cause, unwilling to recalculate the costs once the bill starts coming due, and willing to let the actual human beings caught in the middle absorb the consequences of an ambition that was, from the very beginning, disconnected from what the world could actually bear. There is also something uncomfortably familiar about this story if you look at it from enough distance. A dominant power convinced that restoring a lost golden age is not just desirable but morally necessary. A quick, decisive early victory that convinces its architects the whole project will be cheap and short. An unforeseen external shock, in this case a pandemic, that no one budgeted for and that changes the entire calculus of the campaign. A prolonged occupation that alienates the very population it claims to be liberating, because unpaid, undisciplined garrisons behave less like protectors and more like occupiers. And finally, a victory so expensive that the victor cannot actually hold what it won, leaving the door open for the next power to walk in and take it instead. Historians of empire have pointed to this pattern again and again in the centuries since, from failed reconquests to modern nation-building projects that succeeded militarily and collapsed politically within a few years of the last soldier declaring victory. The Gothic War is one of the oldest and starkest examples of it on record, precisely because it happened at a hinge point in history, when the old Roman world was still just barely alive enough to be worth fighting over, and just fragile enough that fighting over it was enough to kill it for good. So the next time someone tells you the Gothic War was a Roman reconquest, a triumphant restoration of empire, you'll know the fuller truth. You'll know that it began with an emperor's obsession, was accelerated by a convenient murder, was nearly finished by a brilliant general's early victories, and was then dragged into 2 decades of ruin by plague, by mismanagement, and by a Gothic king who understood his enemy's weaknesses better than his enemy understood them himself. You'll know that the war did not save classical Italy. It ended it. And you'll know that the empire that thought it was resurrecting Rome spent 19 years, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, instead digging Rome's actual grave. If this changed the way you think about how empires actually fall, and how the stories we tell about them often hide the truth, hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the forgotten turning points that quietly reshape the ancient and medieval world, the stories that never make it into the textbook summary, but that explain everything that came after. Drop a comment and let me know what you think was the real turning point of this war. Was it the plague? Was it Justinian's ambition? Or was it Totila's rise? I'd love to hear your take. And if you found this useful, make sure to like the video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about understanding history the way it actually happened, not the way it gets simplified. I'll see you in the next one.